The silence hit me first. Walking into what should have been chaos 3 weeks before my wedding, I expected to find my mother frantically coordinating with the caterer, my sister Natalie organizing seating charts, and wedding gifts scattered across every surface. Instead, the house felt hollow, almost reverent. The afternoon light streaming through the living room windows illuminated dust particles floating like tiny ghosts. And somewhere upstairs I could hear the faint sound of fabric rustling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I set down my keys on the marble entryway table, the metallic clink echoing through the empty corridor. My parents had insisted I stop by to pick up the final guest count for the rehearsal dinner, something that could have been handled with a simple text message. But Linda Hoffman, my mother, believed in doing things properly, which meant face-to-face conversations and handwritten notes stored in specific drawers that only she could locate. The rustling upstairs continued, accompanied by what sounded like muffled sobbing. My chest tightened with immediate concern. Natalie had been acting strangely for weeks, canceling our usual sister lunches and avoiding my calls. When she did answer, her voice carried a hollow quality that reminded me of our teenage years when she'd struggled with depression. I'd attributed her recent distance to pre-wedding stress. Everyone seemed to have opinions about my choices, from the venue to the dress to my decision to keep my last name. I climbed the carpeted staircase 2 steps at a time, my ballet flats silent against the thick burgundy runner our mother had installed during her latest redecorating phase. The crying grew clearer as I approached the master bedroom, where my parents stored my wedding dress in their oversized walk-in closet. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I caught a glimpse of white silk. My heart stopped completely. Natalie stood before the full-length mirror, wearing my wedding dress, not trying it on in that playful way sisters sometimes do, but wearing it completely, from the delicate pearl buttons running down the spine to the cathedral-length train that pooled around her feet like spilled cream. She'd styled her hair in an elaborate updo, pinned with the vintage hair combs our grandmother had worn at her own wedding, the ones I'd specifically requested for my ceremony. But what made my blood freeze wasn't just seeing her in my dress. It was the way she stood there, shoulders squared, chin lifted, staring at her reflection with an expression of fierce determination mixed with something that looked like grief. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't sobbing anymore. She was studying herself, memorizing every detail, as if this moment held significance far beyond a simple case of sisterly curiosity. "Natalie," my voice came out as barely a whisper. She spun around, her face cycling through shock, guilt, and then something I couldn't identify. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The dress, which had fit me perfectly during my final fitting just 2 weeks earlier, hung slightly loose on her smaller frame, but the effect was still stunning. She looked beautiful, radiant even, and that realization made everything worse. "Claire." She lifted her hands as if to explain, then dropped them helplessly. "I can explain. Can you?" I stepped into the room, my legs feeling unsteady, "because I'm trying to understand why you're wearing my wedding dress 3 weeks before my wedding." Natalie's composure cracked completely. She sank onto the edge of our parents' bed, the silk cascading around her like she was drowning in it. "You don't understand. You couldn't possibly understand." The way she said it, with such finality and pain, sent a chill through. This wasn't about trying on a pretty dress, or even some misguided attempt at sisterly bonding. Something deeper was happening here, something that had been building beneath the surface of our family's carefully maintained harmony. I sat down beside her, careful not to touch the dress. Up close, I could see that she'd been crying for more than just a few minutes. Her makeup was completely ruined, and her eyes were red and swollen. Whatever had driven her to put on my wedding dress had been weighing on her for some time. "Try me," I said softly. "We used to tell each other everything." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound that held no humor. "Did we? Did we really, Claire? Or did we just tell each other the things that were safe to share?" I felt a familiar frustration rising. Natalie had always had a tendency toward drama, a flair for making situations more complicated than they needed to be. Growing up, she'd been the sister who turned minor disagreements into theatrical productions, who could find hidden meanings in the most innocent comment. But looking at her now, dressed in my wedding gown with her face streaked with tears, I realized this wasn't theatrics. This was genuine anguish. "What are you talking about? What secrets could we possibly have that would make you do this?" Natalie stood abruptly and walked back to the mirror, smoothing down the skirt with shaking hands. "Do you remember when we were kids, and people used to comment on how different we looked? How I had Dad's dark hair and brown eyes, while you got Mom's blonde hair and blue eyes?" Genetics work that way, Nat. Families don't always look identical. That's what I told myself too. That's what everyone told me. She turned away from the mirror to face me directly. But then I started noticing other things. How mom and dad acted differently around me, especially when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Little comments, sideways glances, conversations that stopped when I entered a room. My chest tightened with a growing sense of unease. You're imagining things. And she reached into the dresser drawer and pulled out a manila envelope that looked official and intimidating. 3 months ago, I decided to surprise Daniel with one of those ancestry DNA kits for his birthday. You know how he's always talking about wanting to trace his family tree back to Ireland. I knew Daniel well enough to recognize that genealogy wasn't exactly his passion, but I nodded anyway, unsure where this was heading. When the kit arrived, I realized I'd accidentally ordered two. Rather than waste it, I decided to test my own DNA too. Just for fun, you know, maybe I'd discover some exotic heritage, or find distant relatives we didn't know about. Her voice grew quieter. The results came back last week. She handed me the envelope with trembling fingers. The return address showed a laboratory I'd seen advertised online, one of those companies that promise to unlock your genetic mysteries for a reasonable fee. I stared at it without opening it, suddenly afraid of what I might find inside. Natalie, whatever this says, it doesn't change anything between us. You're my sister, that's just it, Claire. Her voice broke completely. I'm not. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back or ignore. I opened the envelope with mechanical movements, my brain struggling to process what she was telling me. The papers inside were filled with scientific terminology and genetic markers that meant nothing to me, but one section stood out with devastating clarity. Probability of relatedness. The document indicated that based on DNA analysis, there was no biological relationship between Natalie Hoffman and Richard Hoffman, the man we both called Dad our entire life. Moreover, a comparison with our mother's genetic information, which Natalie had somehow obtained, showed similar results. How did you get Mom's DNA? I asked, my voice barely functioning. Hair from her brush, saliva from a coffee cup. Natalie's confession came out in a rush. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to know for sure. The lab ran the comparison as a favor when I explained the situation. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of numbers and percentages that were rewriting everything I thought I knew about our family. This could be wrong. These tests aren't always accurate. I had it run twice at different laboratories, same results. She sat back down beside me, the wedding dress rustling with her movements. Claire, I'm not their biological daughter. I'm not your biological sister. The room seemed to tilt around me. 26 years of shared memories, inside jokes, and sister bonds suddenly felt like they were built on a foundation of love. Family vacations where Natalie and I had rolled our eyes at our parents' embarrassing behavior. Late-night conversations about boys and dreams and fears. The way we'd protected each other from our mother's perfectionist expectations. All of it now carried a different weight. But that doesn't make sense. You were born when I was 2. I remember Mom being pregnant. Do you though? Do you actually remember? Or do you remember the stories they told you and the pictures they showed you? Natalie's voice was gentle but insistent. I've been thinking about this constantly since I got the results. I went through every photo album, every family video, looking for evidence of Mom being pregnant with me. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo she'd taken of our family album. Look at this picture from your second birthday party. Mom's wearing a loose dress, but she doesn't look pregnant. And here's one from 3 months later, where I'm suddenly a newborn in the hospital. I studied the images, my mind racing to fill in gaps that had never seemed important before. There could be explanations. Maybe she carried differently with you, or maybe those pictures were taken out of order. Maybe, or maybe I was adopted and they never told me. The possibility hit me like a physical blow. Our parents had always been private people, the type who believed family business should stay within the family. It wouldn't be completely out of character for them to make a major decision like adoption and simply never discuss it, especially if they'd convinced themselves they were protecting us from unnecessary complications. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why put on my wedding dress to tell me that? Natalie's face crumpled again. Because if I'm not really your sister, then Daniel isn't really my brother-in-law. And if that's true, then maybe the feelings I've been having aren't as wrong as I thought they were. The confession dropped between us like a bomb. Suddenly, Natalie's recent behavior made terrible sense. Her avoidance of family gatherings where Daniel would be present. Her reluctance to participate in wedding planning. The way she'd seemed almost grief-stricken every time I mentioned my upcoming marriage. Natalie, please tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying. I tried so hard to stop it, Claire. You have to believe me. I tried to convince myself it was just stress or some kind of psychological reaction to your engagement. But when I got these DNA results and realized we might not be related, she gestured helplessly at the wedding dress. I needed to see what it would feel like to be the one marrying him. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the revelation about our biological relationship, which was devastating enough, but the knowledge that my sister, the person I'd trusted most in the world, had been harboring romantic feelings for my fiancé. I tried to speak but found my throat completely closed. I know how this looks, Natalie continued desperately. I know you must hate me right now, but Claire, if we're not actually sisters, then maybe Daniel and I can be together without it being wrong. Maybe this whole situation is the universe's way of telling us something. I found my voice, though it came out as a croak. Have you told him? Does Daniel know how you feel? The question hung in the air while Natalie's face answered before her words. Guilt and defiance warred in her expression, and I realized with growing horror that this conversation with me wasn't the first one she'd had about this situation. We haven't done anything inappropriate.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She said quickly. After I got the DNA results, I was so confused and upset that I needed someone to listen. Daniel happened to call looking for you when you were at work, and I ended up telling him everything. Everything about the DNA test, about questioning whether I was really part of this family, about how confusing it's been to have feelings that seemed wrong but might not be if the test results are accurate. She took a shaky breath. He was very kind about it, Claire. He didn't judge me or make me feel terrible. The careful way she phrased it told me there was more to the story. What else, Natalie? What aren't you telling me? She stood up again and walked to the window, the wedding dress trailing behind her like a beautiful, horrible reminder of everything that was falling apart. He said he'd always felt a special connection to me, but that he'd never acted on it because he thought we were family. He said if the DNA results were accurate, it would change things. The room felt like it was spinning. My fiancé, the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks, had essentially told my sister that he would consider being with her if she could prove we weren't related. The man who'd proposed to me 6 months earlier with a speech about how much he loved our family and wanted to be part of it forever, had been waiting for a genetic loophole to pursue my sister instead. When did this conversation happen? Last Tuesday. Her voice was barely audible. Last Tuesday, 6 days ago, which meant that for nearly a week, both my sister and my fiancé had been sitting on this information while I continued planning our wedding, calling caterers, addressing invitations, and dreaming about our future together. They'd let me continue living in ignorance while they explored the possibility of being together. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady but my mind suddenly crystal clear. Take off the dress. Claire, please, let me explain more. There are things you don't understand about your relationship with Daniel, things I've noticed that maybe you haven't. Take off my wedding dress right now. The coldness in my voice seemed to shock her into compliance. She turned around so I could unbutton the long row of pearl buttons running down the spine, the same buttons I'd practiced fastening and unfastening during my dress fittings. My hands shook as I worked, and I had to fight the urge to rip the delicate fabric away from her body. When the dress finally pooled at her feet, Natalie stepped out of it wearing only her slip. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, but I felt no sympathy for her. The woman standing before me had betrayed our relationship in ways I was still trying to comprehend. I gathered up the wedding dress carefully, fighting back tears as I hung it on the padded hanger where it belonged. The dress that was supposed to represent the beginning of my happily ever after now felt contaminated, like wearing it would somehow transfer my sister's betrayal onto my own body. I need you to leave, I said without turning around. Claire, please, we need to talk about what this means for the family. If I'm adopted, then Mom and Dad have been lying to us our entire lives. Don't you want to know the truth? I finally turned to face her. The truth is that you've been having an emotional affair with my fiancé, and using a DNA test as justification. The truth is that instead of coming to me with your concerns about our family, you went to him first. The truth is that you put on my wedding dress to fantasize about marrying the man I love. But if we're not really sisters, we are sisters, I interrupted firmly. Biology doesn't determine family, Natalie. Love does. Loyalty does. Shared experiences and mutual support determine family. And you've just shown me that whatever genetic connection we may or may not have, you're not acting like family. She flinched as if I'd struck her. That's not fair. I never meant for any of this to happen. Get dressed and get out. I need time to think. As Natalie gathered her clothes and left the room, I remained standing beside my wedding dress, trying to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. In the span of 20 minutes, my understanding of my family, my relationship, and my upcoming wedding had been completely shattered. The DNA test results lay scattered on the bed like evidence of a crime. If they were accurate, then my parents had maintained a decades-long deception about Natalie's origins. If they were accurate, then my sister's feelings for my fiancé weren't technically incestuous. If they were accurate, then everything I thought I knew about my family was a carefully constructed lie. But even if the results were accurate, the betrayal remained the same. Natalie had developed feelings for Daniel and had shared those feelings with him before discussing any of this with me. Daniel had encouraged those feelings by admitting to his own supposed attraction. Together they had explored the possibility of a relationship, while allowing me to continue planning a wedding that now felt like an elaborate farce. I heard the front door close as Natalie left, and the house returned to its previous silence. But now the quiet felt charged with secrets and lies, every shadow hiding another potential revelation that could further destroy the life I thought I'd built. My phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel asking what time I wanted to meet for dinner. The normalcy of the message felt surreal given what I'd just discovered. He was texting me about dinner plans while contemplating a future with my sister. I didn't respond to the message. Instead, I sat down on my parents' bed and tried to figure out what to do next. The wedding was 3 weeks away, with deposits paid, guests invited, and plans finalized. My relationship with my sister was shattered, possibly permanently. My relationship with my fiancé was based on lies and deception, and my relationship with my parents might be built on a foundational secret they'd kept for 24 years. The DNA test results stared at me from the bedspread, clinical and definitive in their conclusion. But I realized that confirming or disproving Natalie's biological connection to our family was only the first step in unraveling this mess. I needed to understand how long Daniel and Natalie had been having these feelings for each other, whether anything physical had happened between them, and what my parents knew about Natalie's origin. Most importantly, I needed to figure out whether the wedding I'd been planning was worth saving, or whether I should walk away from all of it and start over. The late afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor where my wedding dress hung like a ghost of the future I'd imagined. 3 weeks ago, that future had seemed certain and bright. Now it felt as fragile and uncertain as everything else in my suddenly upended world. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at Grace Thompson's name. Grace had been my mother's closest friend since college, practically an aunt to Natalie and me growing up. If anyone would know the truth about Natalie's origins, it would be Grace. More importantly, Grace had always been the one person in our family's orbit who told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Before I could second-guess myself, I pressed call. "Claire, honey, what a lovely surprise," Grace answered after 2 rings. "How are the wedding preparations coming along?" "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The change in my tone must have been apparent because Grace's voice immediately became more serious. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? Is Natalie adopted?" The long pause that followed told me everything I needed to know before Grace spoke a single word. The silence stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Grace finally spoke, her voice was careful and measured in a way that confirmed my worst fears. "Claire, that's not really my place to discuss. You should talk to your parents about family matters." "Grace, please." "I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important. Something has happened, and I need to know the truth about Natalie's background." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a deep sigh. "Where are you right now?" "At Mom and Dad's house." "Are they "No, they're at some charity function downtown." "Grace, please." I found Natalie wearing my wedding dress today, and she showed me DNA test results that say she's not biologically related to our family. I need to know if that's possible. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me I'd just confirmed something Grace had been hoping to avoid discussing. "Oh, Claire, I was afraid something like this might happen eventually." My heart sank. "So it's true? She really is adopted?" "It's complicated, honey. Much more complicated than a simple adoption." Grace's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Can you come over? This isn't something we should discuss over the phone, and there are things you need to understand about the situation before you talk to your parents." "I'll be right there." I hung up the phone and looked around my parents' bedroom one more time. The wedding dress hung innocently in the closet. the DNA test results were scattered across the bed, and somewhere in this house were 24 years of family photos and memories that might all be based on carefully maintained lies. As I gathered the DNA paperwork and headed downstairs, I realized that finding Natalie in my wedding dress had been just the beginning. Whatever Grace was about to tell me would either explain everything or make the situation infinitely more complicated. The drive to Grace's house took 15 minutes through Portland's tree-lined suburban streets, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had formed the backdrop of my childhood. Everything looked the same as it always had, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. How many other families in these perfect houses were harboring secrets as significant as the one that was apparently about to be revealed? Grace lived in a modest craftsman-style home that smelled perpetually of coffee and lavender. She'd never married or had children of her own, but she'd been a constant presence in Natalie's and my lives, the cool aunt who remembered our birthdays and listened to our problems without judgment. If she knew something about Natalie's origins that our parents had kept secret, it explained why she'd sometimes seem to understand Natalie in ways that our parents didn't. She opened the door before I could knock, her expression grave but somehow relieved. "I've been dreading this conversation for 24 years, she said, pulling me into a hug, but I'm glad it's finally happening. Her living room was exactly as I remembered it, filled with books and plants and comfortable furniture that invited long conversation. She gestured for me to sit on the familiar floral sofa while she settled into her reading chair, the one where she'd read us stories during countless childhood visits. "Before I tell you what I know," Grace began carefully, "I need you to understand that your parents made their decisions from a place of love. They may have been wrong about some things, but their intentions were always to protect both you and Natalie. Grace, just tell me what happened." "I can handle whatever it is," she nodded and took a deep breath. 24 years ago, your mother had just given birth to you. It was a difficult pregnancy and delivery, and the doctors told her that she wouldn't be able to have more children safely. Your parents were devastated, because they'd always planned to have a large family. I shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, unsure where this story was heading but certain it wasn't anywhere good. About a year later, your mother's younger sister Kelly showed up at your house. She was pregnant, unmarried and completely panicked about what to do. Kelly had always been the wild child of the family, and she'd gotten involved with someone who wasn't exactly father material. Grace paused to pour herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the coffee table, her hands shaking slightly. Kelly was only 19, barely supporting herself with part-time jobs, and she knew she couldn't raise a child, but she also couldn't bear the thought of giving the baby to strangers. The pieces were starting to come together in my mind, but I needed to hear it spelled out clearly. "Are you saying that Natalie is actually my cousin? That my Aunt Kelly is her biological mother?" "Yes, but it's more complicated than that." Grace's voice grew even more careful. "Kelly agreed to let your parents adopt the baby, but only if they promised never to tell anyone the truth about the biological relationship. She was ashamed of her situation and didn't want the child to grow up knowing that her mother had essentially abandoned her." I felt sick. "So my parents have been lying to both of us for Natalie's entire life? They thought they were protecting her, and protecting you in a way from having to keep such a big secret." Grace leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Kelly made them promise that if anyone ever asked direct questions about Natalie's parentage, they would deny any biological connection to her. She was terrified that if the truth came out, people would judge both her and the child. But that means Natalie really isn't my sister. She's my cousin. Biologically, yes, but Claire, she's been your sister in every way that matters for 24 years. Your parents raised her as their own daughter, and you grew up together as siblings. The love and bond between you is completely real, regardless of genetics." I thought about the DNA test results and how they'd shown no biological relationship between Natalie and our father, but how they might have shown a different story if they'd tested her against our mother's DNA more carefully. Cousins would share some genetic markers, but not enough to register as a parent-child relationship. "Does Natalie know any of this? Has she ever suspected?" Grace shook her head. "As far as I know, she has no idea. Kelly moved to California shortly after the birth, and has had minimal contact with the family since then. Your parents have been incredibly careful never to let anything slip." "Where is Kelly now? Is she still alive?" "She lives in San Diego. She's married now, has 2 other children. As far as I know, she's never told her husband about Natalie. It's like that part of her life never happened." The enormity of the family secret was overwhelming. My parents had not only hidden Natalie's true parentage, but had also maintained a decades-long deception that involved cutting off contact with my mother's sister. They built their family on a foundation of lies, however well-intentioned those lies might have been. Grace, there's something else I need to tell you, something that makes this situation even more complicated. I explained about finding Natalie in my wedding dress, about her confession regarding her feelings for Daniel, and about Daniel's apparent reciprocation of those feelings. Grace listened with growing alarm, occasionally shaking her head or making soft sounds of distress. "Oh, that poor girl," Grace said when I finished. "She must be so confused. And Daniel, well, I never thought much of him anyway, if I'm being honest." "What do you?" Grace looked uncomfortable, as if she'd said more than she intended. "I probably shouldn't comment on your relationship, Claire. It's not my place. After everything else that's been revealed today, please don't start keeping secrets from me now." She sighed deeply. "I've always felt that Daniel was more interested in your family's social status than he was in you personally. Your parents have worked hard to build a certain reputation in this community, and Daniel has always seemed very aware of the advantages that come with being associated with the Hoffman name." The observation stung because it touched on insecurities I'd tried to ignore throughout our relationship. Daniel had indeed seemed particularly interested in impressing my parents, and he'd made several comments about how helpful my father's business connections might be for his own career advancement. "Do you think he's using?" "I think he's a young man who's very focused on building the life he wants, and I think you represent several things that fit into that plan. Whether genuine love is one of them." Grace shrugged helplessly. "Only he knows for sure." The conversation with Grace had provided answers to some questions while raising others. I now knew that Natalie was my cousin rather than my sister, which explained the DNA test results while simultaneously making her feelings for Daniel slightly less taboo from a genetic standpoint. But it didn't excuse the emotional betrayal, and it didn't address the larger question of whether my entire relationship with Daniel was built on false foundations. As I drove home from Grace's house, my mind raced with plans and possibilities. I needed to confront my parents about their decades of deception. I needed to have a serious conversation with Daniel about his true feelings and motivations, and I needed to figure out what to do about the wedding that was supposed to take place in less than 3 weeks. But first I needed an ally, someone who could help me navigate this situation and ensure that I made decisions based on truth rather than emotion or panic. Grace had been helpful, but she was too close to my parents to be completely objective. I needed someone who cared about my well-being but wasn't invested in maintaining family harmony at all costs. As I pulled into the parking garage beneath my downtown loft, I realized there was only one person who fit that description: my college roommate and best friend Ashley Morgan. Ashley was a family law attorney who specialized in adoption cases and genetic rights. More importantly, she was fiercely loyal and had never been impressed by Daniel's charm or my family's social standing. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, mentally preparing for what would likely be a very long and difficult phone call. Ashley lived in Seattle now, but she'd always made it clear that she was available whenever I needed her, regardless of the time or circumstance. My apartment felt like a sanctuary after the emotional chaos of the day. The clean lines and minimalist decor that Daniel had always criticized for being too impersonal now felt comforting in their simplicity. There were no family photos to remind me of the lies I'd grown up believing. No wedding planning materials scattered across every surface to mock my current situation. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my sofa with my phone. Ashley answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the enthusiasm that had made her such a formidable law student. "Claire, perfect timing. I was just thinking about your wedding. How are the final preparations going?" "Ashley, I need your help with something. Legal help and personal help." The change in my tone had the same effect on Ashley that it had on Grace earlier. Her voice immediately became more focused and professional. "What's wrong?" I told her everything. The wedding dress incident, the DNA test results, the conversation with Grace about my family's adoption secret, Daniel's apparent willingness to pursue a relationship with my sister cousin, and my growing doubts about my upcoming marriage. Ashley listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or concern. "Jesus, Claire, this is like a soap opera, except it's your actual life. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to figure out what to do next. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and I can't marry Daniel without knowing the truth about his feelings and motivations. Okay, let's break this down into manageable pieces," Ashley said, her legal training kicking in. "First, the adoption issue. Your parents may have thought they were protecting Natalie, but keeping her biological parentage secret could have serious legal implications. especially if there are any inheritance or medical history issues down the line. What kind of implication? Well, if Natalie ever needs to access her biological family's medical history for health reasons, or if Kelly decides she wants to establish a relationship with her biological daughter, the current situation could become very complicated very quickly. There are also questions about Natalie's legal rights to information about her origins. I hadn't considered the medical implications. What should I do about that? That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to force your parents to tell Natalie the truth, or do you want to let her make her own decisions about pursuing it? It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a clear answer to. Part of me felt that Natalie deserved to know the truth about her biological origins, especially since she'd already discovered that something wasn't right about her parenting. But another part of me wasn't sure I could trust her with that information given her current emotional state and her apparent willingness to betray our relationship. I think I need to talk to my parents first, find out their perspective on the situation, and whether they're willing to tell her the truth voluntarily. That's probably wise. And what about Daniel? Have you decided how you want to handle that situation? The Daniel question was more complicated because it touched on my deepest insecurities about our relationship. I need to know whether he actually loves me, or whether he's been using me for some kind of social or professional advance, and I need to know how long he's been having feelings for Natalie. Are you prepared for the possibility that the answers to those questions might not be what you want to hear? I think so. I mean, I'd rather know the truth and deal with it than marry someone who doesn't actually love me. Good. Because from what you've told me, there are some red flags about Daniel's behavior that go beyond just this situation with Natalie. Ashley's observation echoed what Grace had said earlier, and it forced me to confront concerns I'd been suppressing for months. Daniel had indeed seemed more interested in impressing my parents than in building a genuine partnership with me. He'd been dismissive of my career goals, and had frequently suggested that I should focus more on supporting his ambition. He'd also shown a troubling tendency to flirt with other women when he thought I wasn't paying attention. What do you think I should do? I think you should postpone the wedding until you get some answers. And I think you should be prepared for the possibility that those answers might mean ending the relationship entirely. The suggestion of postponing the wedding sent a wave of panic through me. The deposits, the invitations, the guests who'd already made travel arrangements, the social embarrassment of calling off a wedding 3 weeks beforehand. But as I considered the alternative, marrying Daniel while harboring serious doubts about his motives and fidelity, postponement began to seem like the lesser of two evils. How would I even do that? The venue, the caterer, all the arrangements. Claire, you're a graphic designer with excellent organizational skills. You planned this entire wedding in 6 months. You can figure out how to postpone it for a few weeks or months, while you sort out your personal situation. She was right, though the logistics still felt overwhelming. Will you help me? I know you're busy with your own cases, but I could really use someone in my corner who doesn't have a vested interest in maintaining family peace. Of course I'll help you. I can drive down this weekend if you want. We can figure out a strategy for dealing with all of this. The relief I felt at having Ashley's support was immense. For the first time since finding Natalie in my wedding dress, I felt like I had a clear path forward, even if that path was likely to be difficult and emotionally challenging. After hanging up with Ashley, I sat in my quiet apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. The wine glass in my hand felt heavy, and the silence that had seemed comforting when I first arrived now felt oppressive. Outside my windows, Portland's evening lights twinkled like stars, but they might as well have been a million miles away for all the connection I felt to the normal world continuing around me. My phone buzzed again with another text from Daniel, this one more insistent than the last. Where are you? We had dinner plans. Getting worried. The casual concern in his message felt like mockery given what I now knew about his conversations with Natalie. I stared at the screen, trying to decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand explanations and honesty while my emotions were still raw and real, but Ashley's advice echoed in my mind. I needed a strategy, not an emotional outburst that could make the situation worse. I typed back a simple response. Family emergency. Need to reschedule. We'll call you tomorrow. It wasn't entirely a lie. This was definitely a family emergency, even if it wasn't the kind Daniel would be expecting. His reply came back almost instantly. What's wrong? Do you need me to come over? The offer of support might have been touching under different circumstances, but now it felt calculated. Was he genuinely concerned about me, or was he trying to gather information about what I might know? After today's revelations, I found myself questioning every interaction we'd ever had, looking for signs of deception or manipulation that I might have missed. No, I'm fine, just need some space tonight. I turned off my phone before he could respond and settled deeper into my sofa, pulling a soft throw blanket around my shoulders. The apartment felt like a cocoon, protecting me from the chaos that was surely brewing in the rest of my world. Tomorrow I would have to face difficult conversations and make impossible decisions, but tonight I could simply exist in the strange calm that sometimes follows devastating revelation. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my windows and my neck was stiff from sleeping awkwardly on the sofa. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 32 text messages, most from Daniel but several from Natalie and 2 from my mother. The digital avalanche of concern and confusion made my stomach clench with anxiety. Daniel's messages progressed from worry to confusion to irritation as the night wore on. The most recent one, sent at 6:47 a.m., simply said, "Claire, this is ridiculous. Call me immediately." Natalie's messages were more emotional, ranging from desperate apologies to angry accusations that I was overreacting to pleas for forgiveness. Reading them felt like watching someone have a breakdown in real time, and despite my anger at her betrayal, I felt a pang of sympathy for the confusion and pain she was obviously experiencing. My mother's messages were characteristically practical. Grace called. "We need to come to the house this morning." So Grace had already spoken to my parents. Part of me was relieved that I wouldn't have to be the one to break the news about what I'd discovered, but another part was anxious about facing their reaction to my knowledge of their decades-old secret. I made coffee and toast, forcing myself to eat despite having no appetite. The routine felt surreal given the magnitude of what I was dealing with, but I'd learned from past crises that maintaining basic self-care helped me think more clearly when everything else felt chaotic. My phone rang as I was finishing breakfast. Ashley's name appeared on the screen, and I answered gratefully. "How are you holding up?" she asked without preamble. I slept on the sofa and woke up to a phone full of messages from people who want explanations I am not ready to give. "Have you talked to your parents yet? My mother wants me to come to the house this morning." Grace apparently already called them. "Good, that saves you from having to figure out how to bring it up. Are you ready for that conversation?" I considered the question serious. Was I ready to confront my parents about a 24-year deception that had shaped my entire family dynamic? Was anyone ever ready for something like that? I don't think anyone's ever ready for this kind of conversation, but I need answers before I can figure out what to do about everything else. Fair enough. What about Daniel? Are you going to talk to him today too? I don't know. Part of me wants to get it over with, but part of me thinks I should have all the information before I make any accusations or decisions. Ashley was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her lawyer brain processing the situation. "You know, there might be a way to get some of those answers without directly confronting him yet." "What do you mean?" "Well, if Daniel has been having feelings for Natalie for a while, there might be evidence of that in his phone, his computer, his social media activity. People aren't usually as careful about hiding their digital tracks as they think they are." The suggestion made me uncomfortable. "You're talking about snooping through his personal things." "I'm talking about protecting yourself from marrying someone who might be deceiving you." "Look, I'm not saying you should hack into his accounts or anything illegal, but if you have legitimate access to shared accounts or devices, and you use that access to verify information that directly affects your decision about marriage, that's not unreasonable." I thought about Daniel's laptop, which he often left at my apartment when he stayed over. He'd given me his Netflix password months ago, and I'd helped him set up his social media accounts when we first started dating. It wouldn't be difficult to check his recent activity if I wanted to. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "First I need to deal with my parents." After ending the call with Ashley, I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel confident and composed. If I was going to confront my parents about a decades-old lie, I wanted to feel like I was in control of at least something. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, though logically I knew it was the same 15 minutes it had always. Every familiar landmark seemed to carry new weight now that I understood how much of my family's story had been carefully curated fiction. I pulled into their driveway behind my father's Mercedes, noting that both cars were there despite it being a Tuesday morning when they would normally be at work. Grace's Toyota was parked on the street, confirming that this was going to be a full family discussion rather than a casual conversation. My mother opened the front door before I could knock, her face showing a mixture of anxiety and resignation that I'd never seen before. Linda Hoffman was usually the picture of composed elegance, but today she looked older and more fragile than I remembered. "Claire, sweetheart, come in, we're in the living room." The formal living room was reserved for special occasions and serious conversations, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. My father sat in his usual chair, still wearing his business suit but with his tie loosened and his normally perfect hair slightly disheveled. Grace occupied the spot on the sofa where she'd sat during countless family gatherings over the years, but today her presence felt more like that of a counselor than a family friend. "Sit down, honey," my mother said, gesturing to the chair across from my father. "Grace has told us about your conversation yesterday." I remained standing, suddenly feeling like sitting would put me at a disadvantage. "Is it true? Is Natalie actually Kelly's daughter?" The direct question hung in the air for a long moment before my father cleared his throat. "Yes, it's true. But Claire, you have to understand the circumstances. Kelly was in an impossible situation, and we thought we were doing the right thing for everyone involved." "The right thing would have been honesty," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. 24 years of lies isn't protecting anyone. It's just making everything more complicated. My mother's composure cracked slightly. "We never intended for it to go on this long. Kelly made us promise to keep the secret, and as time went on, it seemed harder and harder to find the right moment to tell the truth." "There were 1,000 right moments," I shot back. "When Natalie started asking questions about why she looked different, when she was old enough to understand adoption, when she turned 18 and legally became an adult, when she started having identity issues that might have been resolved by knowing the truth about her background." Grace leaned forward in her chair. "Claire, your parents made the best decision they could with the information they had at the time. Blaming them now doesn't help anyone." "I'm not blaming them for the original decision," I clarified. "I'm blaming them for maintaining the lie for 24 years without considering the consequences." My father stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture I recognized from childhood conversations when he was trying to maintain his authority while acknowledging he'd made a mistake. "You're right," he said quietly. "We should have told both of you the truth years ago. We kept thinking we'd find the right way to handle it, and we kept putting it off until it seemed impossible to bring up without causing more damage than good." The admission deflated some of my anger, replacing it with a sadness that felt almost worse. These were the parents who had raised me to value honesty and integrity, and they'd been living with a fundamental deception for my entire adult life. "Does Natalie know that you know?" my mother asked. "No. She thinks her DNA test proved she's not related to anyone in the family. She doesn't know about Kelly. Maybe it's better that way," Grace suggested gently. "Kelly has built a new life in California. She has a husband and 2 children who don't know about Natalie. Revealing the connection now could disrupt multiple families." I turned to stare at Grace, amazed by her suggestion. "So your solution is to continue lying, to let Natalie think she's completely alone in the world rather than tell her she has a biological mother who's still alive." "I'm saying that sometimes the truth causes more harm than good," Grace replied defensively. "And I'm saying that's not our decision to make for her. Natalie deserves to know where she came from, and Kelly's other children deserve to know they have a half-sister. You can't just pretend people don't exist because it's convenient." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. We all froze as footsteps crossed the entryway, followed by Natalie's voice calling out, "Mom? Dad? Claire's car is here, we need to talk." My parents exchanged panicked glances. Whatever they'd planned to discuss with me clearly hadn't included the possibility of Natalie showing up before we'd reached any conclusions. "In here, sweetheart," my mother called, her voice artificially bright. Natalie appeared in the living room doorway, and I was shocked by her appearance. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her normally perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 24 years. "I know you're all talking about me," she said without preamble. "Grace, I saw your car outside, and Claire, you're not answering my calls or texts. I deserve to know what's going on." She sat down heavily on the sofa next to Grace, her posture radiating exhaustion and defeat. "I know you think I'm terrible because of what happened yesterday. I know you think I'm a horrible person for having feelings for Daniel, but you have to understand how confused I've been." "Natalie," my father began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "No, let me finish. I've been questioning everything about my identity for months. The DNA test just confirmed what I'd been suspecting for years. I don't fit in this family, and now I know why." Her voice broke slightly. "And if I'm not really Claire's sister, then maybe the feelings I've been having aren't as wrong as I thought they were." The pain in her voice was genuine, and despite everything that had happened, I felt my anger toward her beginning to soften slightly. She was clearly struggling with the same identity crisis that would have affected anyone in her situation. "Natalie," I said gently, You are my sister, biology doesn't determine family relationships. We grew up together, we shared experiences, we cared for each other. That doesn't change because of a DNA test. But it does change things, she insisted. It changes how I'm supposed to feel about Daniel. It changes whether I have a right to pursue those feelings. My mother made a small sound of distress, and I realized that Natalie's confession about Daniel was news to my parents. They'd been focused on the adoption secret and hadn't known about the more immediate crisis involving my fiancé. What feelings about Daniel? My father asked, his voice taking on the protective tone I remembered from my teenage years. Natalie looked at me uncertainly, as if asking permission to share her story. I nodded slightly, figuring that if we were having a family truth-telling session, everything might as well come out. I've been having romantic feelings for him, Natalie said simply. I tried to fight them because I thought they were inappropriate, but when I got the DNA results, and realized we might not be related, I talked to him about it. You talked to Daniel about having feelings for him? My mother asked, her voice rising with shock, and he told me that he'd always felt a connection to me too, but that he'd never acted on it because he thought we were family. Natalie's voice grew smaller as she continued. He said if the DNA results were accurate, it would change things between us. The living room fell completely silent. My parents stared at Natalie with expressions of horror and disbelief, while Grace looked like she was witnessing a car accident in slow motion. My father was the first to speak, his voice deadly quiet. Are you telling us that Claire's fiancé has been having inappropriate feelings for you, and that he's told you he would act on those feelings under certain circumstances? It's not inappropriate if we're not really related, Natalie said defensively, though her voice lacked conviction. It's inappropriate because he's engaged to your sister, my father snapped. Regardless of your biological relationship to this family, Daniel is supposed to be committed to Claire. The fact that he's even entertaining the possibility of being with someone else is completely unacceptable. My mother turned to me with an expression of fierce maternal protectiveness. Claire, please tell me you're not still planning to marry this man. The question forced me to confront the decision I'd been avoiding since yesterday. Was I still planning to marry Daniel? Could I marry someone who had essentially told my sister that he would consider being with her if she could prove we weren't related? I don't know, I admitted. I need to talk to him first. I need to understand exactly what he said to Natalie, and what his true feelings are. His true feelings. My father stood up abruptly. His true feelings are that he's willing to abandon his commitment to you for the possibility of being with someone else. What more do you need to understand? The anger in my father's voice was comforting in a strange way. Despite the deception about Natalie's origins, his protective instincts toward me were clearly genuine and unchanged. Richard, calm down, my mother said, though her own face was flushed with anger. Getting upset isn't going to help anyone think clearly. I'm upset because our daughter is engaged to a man who's apparently been shopping around for alternatives within the family, my father replied. And I'm upset because we've created a situation where Natalie feels like she doesn't belong here when she absolutely does belong here. He turned to face Natalie directly. You are our daughter. You have been our daughter since you were 3 days old. A DNA test doesn't change 24 years of love and family bond. And any man who would try to use genetic technicalities to justify betraying his fiancée isn't worthy of either of you. The fierce declaration brought tears to Natalie's eyes. But I don't understand where I came from. I don't understand why I don't look like anyone in this family, or why I've always felt slightly different. My parents exchanged another look, and I could see them making a decision in real time. There's something else you need to know, my mother said quietly, about your biological origin. Over the next hour, my parents told Natalie the same story that Grace had shared with me the day before. They explained about Kelly's unexpected pregnancy, her inability to care for a child, and the decision to adopt Natalie while keeping her biological parentage secret. They talked about their motivations for maintaining the secret, and their growing inability to find the right way to reveal the truth as years passed. Natalie listened with a mixture of relief and new confusion. Learning that she was actually my cousin rather than a complete stranger to the family seemed to provide some comfort, but it also raised new questions about her relationship with Kelly and her right to know her biological mother. Is she still alive, Kelly? Natalie asked when they finished. Yes, she lives in California. She's married and has 2 other children, my mother replied carefully. Does she know about me? Does she ever think about me? The question hung in the air, highlighting the complexity of the situation. Kelly had made it clear 24 years ago that she wanted to move forward with her life without maintaining contact with the daughter she'd given up. But people change over the course of 2 decades, and her feelings about the situation might be completely different now. We don't know, my father admitted. We've respected her wishes for no contact, so we haven't spoken to her since shortly after you were born. But I could contact her if I wanted to. Legally, yes, you're an adult, and you have the right to seek out your biological family. But Natalie, you need to be prepared for the possibility that she might not want a relationship. She built a new life, and reconnecting with you could complicate that life in ways she's not ready to handle. I watched Natalie process this information, seeing her cycle through hope, fear, and uncertainty. Learning about Kelly had answered some questions while raising others, and I could see that she was going to need time to decide what she wanted to do with this new knowledge. What about the situation with Daniel? Grace asked, bringing the conversation back to the more immediate crisis. That needs to be resolved regardless of what Natalie decides about contacting Kelly. All eyes turned to me, and I realized that everyone was waiting for me to announce my decision about the wedding. But I still didn't have enough information to make that choice with confidence. I need to talk to Daniel before I decide anything, I said. I need to hear his side of what happened, and understand what he actually said to Natalie. Claire, what more do you need to hear? My mother asked gently. He told your sister that he would consider being with her under certain circumstances. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about his character and his commitment to you. Maybe, but I need to confront him directly. I need to see his reaction when I tell him what I know. And I need to ask him some questions about our relationship that go beyond just this situation with Natalie. My father nodded approvingly. That's wise, but Claire, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that his answers won't be what you want to hear. I know. Ashley already warned me about that. Ashley knows about this, my mother asked. I called her last night. She's driving down from Seattle this weekend to help me figure out what to do about the wedding logistics if I decide to postpone or cancel. The mention of postponing or canceling the wedding brought a new gravity to the conversation. Up until that moment, I think everyone had been hoping that this situation could be resolved without dramatic consequence. But the reality was that my relationship with Daniel might not survive the revelations of the past 24 hours. What can we do to help? Grace asked. For now, just be honest with each other. No more secrets, no more trying to protect people from difficult truths. If we're going to function as a family, we need to be able to trust each other. I looked at Natalie, who had been unusually quiet during the latter part of the conversation. That includes being honest about your feelings and motivation. I understand that you've been confused about your identity, but using that confusion to justify pursuing my fiancé isn't acceptable, regardless of our biological relationship. Natalie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, I'm so sorry, Claire. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just felt so lost and confused, and when Daniel was kind to me about it, I misinterpreted his kindness as something more. What exactly did he say to you? I need to know the specific words. Natalie took a shaky breath. When I told him about the DNA test and how confused I was about my identity, he said that he'd always felt like there was a special connection between us. He said he'd noticed it from the beginning but had never acted on it because he thought we were family. And then, he said that if the DNA test was accurate and we weren't actually related, it would change how he thought about the situation. He said he'd always wondered what might have happened between us under different circumstances. The specific details of the conversation were somehow both better and worse than I'd imagined. Daniel hadn't explicitly propositioned Natalie or declared his love for her, but he definitely indicated that he would consider a relationship with her if the circumstances were different. It was a careful, measured response that maintained plausible deniability while still encouraging her feelings. Did anything physical happen between you two? I asked, dreading the answer. No, Natalie said quickly. Nothing like that. It was just conversation. I felt a small measure of relief, though the emotional betrayal was still devastating. Daniel had essentially told my sister that he would choose her over me if he could find a justification for doing so. That level of disloyalty was difficult to forgive, regardless of whether anything physical had occurred. When are you planning to talk to him? My father asked. Tonight, I think. I want to get it over with, and I want to see his reaction when I tell him what I know about Natalie's biological background. Do you want one of us to be there? My mother offered. No, this is something I need to handle alone, but thank you for offering. As the family meeting wound down, I felt emotionally drained but clearer about what needed to happen next. The conversation with my parents had revealed the full scope of the family secret while also demonstrating their genuine love for both Natalie and me. Despite their poor judgment in maintaining the deception for so long, their motivations had been protective rather than malicious. Natalie's situation was more complicated. While I understood her confusion about her identity, I was still hurt by her willingness to pursue Daniel and by her apparent belief that genetics gave her permission to betray our relationship. We would need time and probably professional counseling to work through the damage that had been done to our sisterly bond. But the most pressing issue was Daniel. Tonight's conversation would determine whether my wedding would proceed as planned, be postponed, or be cancelled entirely. I needed to prepare myself for all three possibilities while hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. As I prepared to leave my parents' house, Natalie caught my arm. "Claire, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but please don't let my mistakes ruin your happiness. If Daniel truly loves you and this was all just a misunderstanding, don't throw away your future because of my confusion." The generous sentiment surprised me, coming from someone who had just confessed to having feelings for my fiancé. But it also reminded me that despite everything that had happened, Natalie was still my sister in all the ways that mattered, and she genuinely wanted me to be happy. "Thank you for saying that. And Natalie, regardless of what happens with Daniel, we're going to work through this family situation together. You belong here and nothing is going to change that." I left my parents' house feeling like I'd survived the first major battle in what was likely to be a longer war. The conversation with Daniel would be the next test, and depending on how that went, I might be facing the challenge of canceling a wedding with 3 weeks' notice. But for the first time since finding Natalie in my wedding dress, I felt like I had a clear understanding of the situation and a plan for moving forward. Whatever happened next, at least I would be making decisions based on truth rather than the carefully constructed fiction that had shaped my family for so long. I spent the afternoon at my apartment preparing for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Daniel had sent increasingly frustrated messages throughout the day, demanding to know what was wrong and why I was avoiding him. His latest text, sent around 3 p.m., had an edge of irritation that I'd never seen before. "Claire, this silent treatment is child. Whatever's wrong, we can discuss it like adults. I'm coming over at 7 p.m. whether you respond or not." The commanding tone bothered me more than it probably should. In our 3 years together, Daniel had occasionally shown flashes of this controlling behavior, but I'd always attributed it to his type A personality and his stress from work. Now, with everything else I'd learned about him, his presumption that he could show up uninvited felt like another red flag I'd been too willing to overlook. I decided to take Ashley's suggestion about checking his digital activity before he arrived. Daniel's laptop sat on my dining table where he'd left it Sunday night, and I knew his password because he'd asked me to check his email for him several times when he was driving. I told myself that I wasn't snooping but rather protecting myself by gathering information that could help me evaluate his honesty during our upcoming conversation. Opening his laptop felt like crossing a line, but I reminded myself that if we were going to be married in 3 weeks, we supposedly trusted each other completely. If Daniel had nothing to hide, then his browsing history and social media activity would confirm his version of events. If he had been deceptive, then I needed to know that before making any permanent commitments. His browser history revealed nothing particularly incriminating at first glance. Work-related sites, news articles, a few sports blogs, and some research about honeymoon destinations in Italy that we'd discussed months ago. But when I dug deeper into his social media activity, a different picture began to emerge. Daniel's Instagram account showed the typical collection of photos from our relationship, but I noticed something troubling in the comment sections. Several attractive women had left flirtatious messages on his posts, and while Daniel's responses were usually brief, they weren't discouraging. More concerning was a private message thread with someone named Jessica Miller that I discovered when I checked his Facebook Messenger. The conversation had started innocuously enough, with Jessica commenting on a photo Daniel had posted from our recent weekend trip to the coast, but it had quickly evolved into something that felt inappropriate for an engaged man. Jessica had written, "You always look so happy in your photos with Claire, but there's something in your eyes that seems restless, like you're looking for something more exciting." Daniel's response had been, "You've always been good at reading people, Jess. Maybe we should catch up in person sometime, and you can tell me what else you see." The exchange continued for several messages, with increasingly personal revelations, and what could only be described as emotional flirtation. Jessica shared details about her recent divorce and her loneliness, while Daniel commiserated and offered support that seemed to cross the line from friendly to intimate. The most recent message, sent just 3 days ago, was from Jessica suggesting they meet for drinks while her ex-husband had the kids for the weekend. Daniel hadn't responded to that particular message yet, but the fact that he hadn't shut down the conversation entirely spoke volumes about his commitment to our relationship. This pattern of behavior predated his conversations with Natalie by months, which suggested that his willingness to consider other options wasn't a recent development triggered by confusion about family relationships. I screenshotted the most damning portions of the conversation and saved them to my phone, feeling sick as I did so. Part of me had hoped that checking Daniel's digital activity would reassure me that his conversation with Natalie had been an isolated incident, caused by unique circumstances. Instead, I discovered evidence of a pattern of emotional infidelity that made me question everything about our relationship. My hands shook as I closed the laptop and tried to process what I'd learned. The man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks had been engaging in inappropriate conversations with multiple women, while maintaining the facade of a committed relationship with me. His interest in Natalie wasn't an aberration caused by family confusion. It was part of a broader pattern of behavior that suggested he was constantly evaluating his options and keeping backup plans available. I called Ashley, needing to talk through my discoveries with someone who could help me think clearly. "How bad is it?" she asked, after I'd explained what I'd found. "Bad enough that I'm questioning whether anything about our relationship has been genuine." These conversations with Jessica go back months, and there are similar patterns with at least 2 other women that I can see. "Claire, I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to find, but it's better to know now than to discover it after you're married. I know that intellectually, but emotionally I feel like my entire life has been built on lies. First my family's deception about Natalie, now Daniel's apparent inability to commit fully to anyone." Ashley was quiet for a moment, before responding. "You know what strikes me about this situation? It's not just that Daniel has been inappropriate with other women, it's that he's been strategic about it. He's maintained plausible deniability in all these conversations while still leaving the door open for something to develop if he decides he wants it to." Her observation was astute and troubling. Daniel's messages were carefully crafted to avoid explicit statements, while still encouraging the women who were interested in him. It was the behavior of someone who wanted to keep multiple options available without technically cheating or being caught in outright lies. "What do you think I should do when he gets here tonight? Be direct. Don't let him manipulate the conversation or turn it around on you. Present the facts you've discovered and ask for explanations. And Claire, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about his responses, it probably is wrong." After hanging up with Ashley, I spent some time organizing my thoughts and preparing for Daniel's arrival. I wanted to approach the conversation strategically rather than emotionally, which meant having a clear agenda and specific questions that would help me evaluate his honesty and character. Daniel arrived at exactly 7 p.m., using his key to let himself into my apartment as he always did. He looked slightly disheveled from what had probably been a stressful day at work, but his expression was more irritated than concerned as he set down his briefcase and turned to face me. "All right, Claire, what's this all about? I've been calling and texting you since yesterday, and I get nothing but cryptic responses about family emergencies and needing space. That's not how relationships work." The accusatory tone in his voice immediately put me on the defensive, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You're right, we do need to talk. Please sit down." Daniel sat on my sofa but remained tense, his body language suggesting that he was prepared for conflict rather than genuine communication. "If this is about me missing dinner last night, I told you I had to work late on the Morrison account. You know how important that client is to the firm. This isn't about dinner plans, Daniel. This is about your conversation with Natalie regarding her DNA test results and your feelings for her." The color drained from Daniel's face so quickly that I knew immediately Natalie had been telling the truth about their interaction. For a moment, he looked genuinely panicked, before his expression shifted to something more calculated and defensive. "What exactly did Natalie tell you?" The fact that his first response was to ask what he'd been accused of rather than to deny having inappropriate conversations confirmed my worst fears. An innocent person would have immediately protested their innocence rather than trying to assess how much trouble they were in. "She told me that she'd shared her confusion about the DNA test results with you, and that you'd indicated you had feelings for her that you'd been suppressing because you thought she was my sister." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen countless times when he was trying to figure out how to handle a difficult situation. "Claire, you have to understand the context of that conversation. Natalie was incredibly upset and confused. She'd just discovered that she might not be biologically related to your family, and she was questioning everything about her identity. That doesn't explain why you told her you'd always felt a connection to her. I was trying to be supportive. She was in crisis, and I was attempting to help her feel less alone and confused." The explanation sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been preparing since Natalie had told him about our confrontation. Daniel, did you or did you not tell my sister that you would consider being with her if she could prove we weren't biologically related? It wasn't that simple. The conversation was much more nuanced than however she described it to you. Then explain the nuances to me. Explain exactly what you said to her and why you said it. Daniel stood up and began pacing, another behavior I recognized as his way of buying time when he was trying to formulate a response. Natalie was talking about how she'd always felt different from your family and how the DNA test confirmed her suspicions. She mentioned that if she wasn't really your sister, then certain feelings she'd been having wouldn't be inappropriate anymore. What feeling? She didn't specify, but it was clear she was talking about romantic feelings. For someone, she was very upset and vulnerable, and I was trying to reassure her that confusion about family relationships was normal and understandable. The evasive answer frustrated me, but I pushed forward. And what did you say about your own feelings? I told her that I'd always cared about her as part of your family and that if the family dynamics were different, our relationship might be different too. Daniel, do you understand how that sounds to someone who's already confused about family relationships and identity? In retrospect, I realize my words could have been misinterpreted. But Claire, you have to understand that I was trying to be kind to someone who was obviously struggling. I studied his face as he spoke, looking for signs of genuine remorse or understanding of how his words had affected both Natalie and me. Instead, I saw someone who was primarily concerned with minimizing his own responsibility for the situation. Let me ask you this directly. Do you have romantic feelings for Natalie? No, of course not. She's your sister, and I would never jeopardize our relationship for something like that. The answer came too quickly and felt too practiced. Moreover, his phrasing bothered me. He'd said he wouldn't jeopardize our relationship, not that he didn't have feelings for Natalie. It was another example of the careful word choice I'd noticed in his digital communications with other women. What about Jessica Miller? The question clearly caught him off guard. His pacing stopped abruptly, and he turned to stare at me with an expression of surprise and growing panic. What about Jessica? I saw your Facebook messages with her. The ones where you agreed that you seem restless in photos with me and suggested meeting up for drinks to discuss what else she might see in your eyes. Daniel's face cycled through several emotions before settling on defensive anger. You went through my private message. Claire, that's a violation of trust and privacy. Is it? Because I thought that when two people were planning to get married, they didn't keep secrets from each other or have inappropriate conversations with other women. Those conversations with Jessica were completely innocent. She's going through a difficult divorce, and I was being supportive as a friend. Friends don't flirt about reading hidden emotions in each other's eyes, Daniel. Friends don't suggest private meetings when someone is feeling lonely and vulnerable. You're taking those messages completely out of context. Then provide the context. Explain to me why an engaged man is having intimate conversations with multiple women about his supposed restlessness and dissatisfaction. The accusation about multiple women seemed to surprise him, and I realized he probably wasn't aware of how much of his digital activity I'd reviewed. His surprise was quickly replaced by a more aggressive defensiveness. I refuse to be interrogated like I'm some kind of criminal. Yes, I have female friends. Yes, sometimes those friendships involve personal conversations. That's normal human behavior, not evidence of infidelity. Personal conversations where you encourage their romantic interest and suggest meeting in person when their husbands are out of town. That's not what those conversations were about. Then what were they about, Daniel? Help me understand why my fiancé is having emotionally intimate conversations with other women while planning a wedding with me. Daniel sat back down heavily, his aggressive posture deflating slightly. For a moment, I thought he might actually provide an honest explanation for his behavior. Instead, he looked at me with an expression that seemed almost pitying. Claire, I think you're overreacting because you're stressed about the wedding and upset about the situation with your family. These messages and conversations aren't as significant as you're making them out to be. The condescending tone in his voice was like a slap in the face. Not only was he refusing to take responsibility for his inappropriate behavior, but he was also attempting to gaslight me into believing that my concerns were unreasonable. Don't do that, Daniel. Don't try to make this about my emotional state or wedding stress. This is about your pattern of behavior with other women and your unwillingness to commit fully to our relationship. Pattern of behavior. Claire, you're being paranoid. Because from where I'm sitting, It looks like you've been keeping multiple backup options available while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to avoid being caught in outright cheating. The accusation hit its mark. Daniel's face flushed with anger, and for the first time in our conversation, his careful composure cracked completely. You know what, Claire? Maybe I have been keeping options open. Maybe I have been questioning whether you're really the right person for me long term. We've been together for 3 years, and sometimes I wonder if we're together out of habit and convenience, rather than genuine passion. The brutal honesty was shocking, even though it confirmed everything I'd been suspecting. And you decided to figure that out by flirting with other women instead of talking to me about your concerns? I tried to talk to you about every time I've suggested that we might benefit from couples counseling or that we should discuss our long-term compatibility, you've brushed me off and insisted that everything was fine. I searched my memory for instances of Daniel expressing concerns about our relationship, but I couldn't recall any significant conversations along those lines. When did you try to talk to me about compatibility issues? Last month, when I suggested we postpone the wedding for 6 months to make sure we were making the right decision. You accused me of getting cold feet and refused to consider it. The conversation he was referring to had lasted all of 10 minutes, and I remembered it differently. He'd mentioned postponing the wedding in passing, without providing any specific reasons or expressing genuine concerns about our relationship. When I'd asked for clarification, he'd backtracked and said he was just feeling overwhelmed by the planning process. That's not how that conversation went, Daniel. You mentioned postponing briefly, without explaining why, and when I asked for details, you said you were just stressed about wedding logistics. Because I knew you'd react exactly the way you're reacting. You don't handle relationship uncertainty well, Claire. You prefer to pretend everything is perfect rather than address real problems. The criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. I did tend to avoid conflict and difficult conversations, preferring to maintain harmony even when issues needed to be addressed. But Daniel's approach of handling his concerns by developing emotional relationships with other women hardly seemed like a mature alternative. Even if I do avoid difficult conversations, that doesn't justify what you've been doing with Natalie and these other women. If you were genuinely concerned about our relationship, the appropriate response would have been to insist on having those difficult conversations, not to start cultivating backup relationships. I never cultivated backup relationships. I have friendships with women, some of which have become deeper because those women actually listen to me and support me in ways that you don't. The implication that I was somehow inadequate as a partner because I didn't provide the emotional support he was seeking from other women felt deeply unfair. What kind of support are you getting from them that you're not getting from me? They make me feel appreciated and desired. They're interested in my thoughts and feelings. They don't dismiss my concerns or try to avoid uncomfortable topics. And in return, you encourage their romantic interest in you while remaining engaged to me. I've never encouraged anyone's romantic interest. I've been a good friend to women who needed emotional support. The denial was so blatantly false, given what I'd read in his messages, that I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Daniel, I read the conversation. You absolutely encouraged Jessica's interest. And based on Natalie's account, you did the same thing with her. You're misinterpreting friendly conversation as something inappropriate because you're looking for problems that don't exist. The gaslighting attempt was so obvious that it actually helped clarify my thinking rather than confusing me further. Daniel was either genuinely delusional about the nature of his conversations with other women, or he was deliberately trying to manipulate me into questioning my own perception. Either way, it wasn't the foundation for a healthy marriage. I think we should postpone the wedding, I said quietly. The announcement seemed to shock Daniel more than anything else I'd said during our conversation. Claire, you're overreacting. We can work through this if you're willing to be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm acknowledging that we have fundamental trust and communication issues that need to be resolved before we make a permanent commitment to each other. So you're willing to throw away 3 years and humiliate both of us publicly because of some misunderstood text messages. The way he framed the decision bothered me almost as much as his original behavior. I'm not throwing anything away, Daniel. I'm protecting both of us from making a mistake that could hurt us much more seriously later on. This is ridiculous. You're letting your sister's confusion and your own insecurities destroy our relationship. My sister's confusion didn't create your pattern of inappropriate behavior with other women. That existed long before Natalie's DNA test results. Daniel stood up abruptly and began gathering his things from around the apartment. Fine. If you want to postpone the wedding because you can't trust me to have normal friendships with other people, then maybe we're not as compatible as I thought we were. Maybe we're not. The calm agreement seemed to deflate his anger. He stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to continue arguing or accept the decision I'd made. What exactly are you proposing? That we postpone for a few weeks while you get over your jealousy, or that we postpone indefinitely while you decide whether you want to be with me at all? I'm proposing that we postpone indefinitely while we both figure out what we actually want from this relationship, and whether we're capable of providing it to each other. And in the meantime, we take a break from each other. No contact while we both think clearly about what we want. A break, Claire, that's essentially a breakup with a different name. Maybe it is. Maybe that's what we need to be honest about. Daniel finished gathering his belongings in silence, his movements sharp and angry. When he reached the door, he turned back to face me one more time. You're making a huge mistake. You're destroying a good relationship because of paranoia and unrealistic expectations about what marriage looks like in the real world. Maybe I am making a mistake, but I'd rather make the mistake of being too cautious than the mistake of marrying someone I can't trust. After Daniel left, I sat in my quiet apartment trying to process what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd gone from being engaged to be married in 3 weeks to being single and facing the monumental task of canceling a wedding. The practical implications were overwhelming, but underneath the anxiety about logistics and social embarrassment, I felt something unexpected: relief. For months I'd been experiencing vague doubts about my relationship with Daniel without being able to articulate exactly what was wrong. His defensive and dismissive responses to my concerns tonight had crystallized those doubts into a clear understanding that we weren't compatible in fundamental ways. Even if he hadn't been inappropriate with other women, his unwillingness to take responsibility for his actions and his tendency to gaslight me when I raised legitimate concerns would have made for a difficult marriage. I called Ashley to update her on the conversation and to begin planning for the wedding cancellation process. "How are you feeling?" she asked after I'd summarized Daniel's responses to my confrontation. "Honestly, I'm sad about losing the relationship I thought I had, but I'm relieved that I found out about these problems before we got married rather than after. That's a healthy perspective. And Claire, based on what you've told me about his responses tonight, I think you made the right decision. Someone who genuinely cared about the relationship would have been horrified by the impact of their actions and focused on making amends rather than defending their behavior. Now I just have to figure out how to cancel a wedding with 3 weeks' notice without completely losing my mind or my dignity. We'll figure it out together. I'll drive down Thursday night and stay for the weekend. Between the two of us, we can handle the logistics. What do I tell people? How do I explain that I'm canceling my wedding because my fiancé was emotionally involved with multiple other women, including my sister who may or may not be my biological sister?" Ashley laughed, though not unkindly. "You don't owe anyone a detailed explanation. You can simply say that you and Daniel have decided you're not compatible and that you're calling off the wedding. People who care about you will respect your privacy, and people who don't aren't worth worrying about." After hanging up with Ashley, I made a list of the most urgent tasks related to canceling the wedding: contacting the venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, and the various other vendors who had been hired for the event. I'd also need to notify the guests, return gifts that had already arrived, and figure out what to do about the dress that had started this entire crisis. The dress. I realized that throughout this entire ordeal, my wedding dress had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with my situation. Natalie wearing it had revealed not only her inappropriate feelings for Daniel but also the family secrets that had been carefully hidden for decades. The dress that was supposed to represent the beginning of my happily ever after had instead become the catalyst for discovering that my life was built on lies and deception. But as I sat in my apartment, planning the cancellation of my wedding, I realized that discovering those lies and deceptions was actually a gift, even if it didn't feel like one at the moment. I was 26 years old with a successful career and good friends. I had time to rebuild my understanding of family relationships and to find a partner who was genuinely committed to building a life together rather than keeping multiple options available. The crisis that had started with finding my sister in my wedding dress had destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but it had also cleared the path for building something more honest and authentic. Whatever came next, it would be based on truth, rather than the carefully maintained facades that had shaped my family and my relationship for so long. The next 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and increasingly uncomfortable conversations with vendors who had been expecting to provide services for my wedding in just over 2 weeks. Each conversation required me to explain that the wedding was being canceled without going into the messy details of why, which proved more emotionally exhausting than I'd anticipated. The florist was sympathetic, but firm about their no-refund policy for orders placed less than 30 days before the event. The photographer expressed genuine concern for my well-being while explaining that they could only refund half of their fee. The venue coordinator, a woman named Margaret, who had been nothing but helpful throughout the planning process, actually offered to waive their cancellation fee when she heard the distress in my voice during our conversation. "Honey, I've been in this business for 15 years, Margaret said gently. I can always tell when someone is calling off a wedding for the right reasons versus the wrong reasons. You sound like someone who's discovered something important about themselves or their partner, and that takes courage to act on." Her kindness brought tears to my eyes, especially since I'd been bracing myself for judgment and irritation from everyone I had to contact. "Thank you for understanding. I know this creates problems for your business. Sweetheart, my business is helping people celebrate love. If canceling this wedding helps you find real love later on, then I've still done my job." The conversation with Margaret was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise grueling process. Most vendors were professional but understandably frustrated by the late cancellation, and several made pointed comments about the financial and professional impact of last-minute changes. By Wednesday evening, I'd managed to contact most of the major vendors and had begun the process of notifying guests. Writing the cancellation message to our guest list proved surprisingly difficult. Ashley had suggested keeping it simple and dignified, but finding the right words to explain that the wedding was off without providing too much detail required several drafts. I finally settled on a brief note that explained Daniel and I had decided we were not compatible for marriage and that we were canceling the wedding by mutual agreement. It was technically true, even if it didn't capture the full complexity of what had led to the decision. The responses from friends and family members varied widely. Some people replied with messages of support and offers to help with anything I needed. Others sent concerned questions, asking if there was anything they could do to help Daniel and me work things out. A few family friends sent slightly judgmental messages about the importance of working through relationship problems rather than giving up at the first sign of trouble. The most difficult responses came from Daniel's side of the guest list. His mother, Patricia Martinez, called me directly on Wednesday night, her voice a mixture of confusion and barely controlled anger. "Claire, Daniel told me that you've decided to cancel the wedding because of some misunderstanding about text messaging. Surely this can be resolved without such drastic measures." I had been dreading this conversation since making the decision to call off the wedding. Patricia had always been kind to me, but she was fiercely protective of her son and tended to believe that most problems in his life were caused by other people's unreasonable expectations. "Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't about a misunderstanding. Daniel and I have discovered that we have fundamental differences in how we view commitment and fidelity in relationships. But you've been together for 3 years. You can't throw away 3 years because of some minor disagreement about appropriate friendship." The way she framed the situation told me that Daniel had presented his version of events without acknowledging the inappropriate nature of his conversations with other women. I wasn't surprised by his selective honesty, but I was disappointed that he was continuing to minimize his role in the relationship's breakdown. This isn't about minor disagreements, and it's not something that can be resolved with more communication. Daniel and I want different things from marriage, and it's better for both of us to acknowledge that now rather than after we've made legal commitments to each other. "Claire, marriage requires compromise and forgiveness. No relationship is perfect, and if you expect perfection, you'll never find happiness with anyone." The lecture about realistic expectations felt particularly galling given that I was being criticized for having standards about fidelity and honesty. "You're absolutely right that marriage requires compromise and forgiveness, but it also requires basic trust and respect. And unfortunately, Daniel and I don't have that foundation." Patricia's voice became sharper. "My son is a good man who made a minor error in judgment. If you can't forgive something so small, then perhaps you're not mature enough for marriage anyway." The personal attack stung, but it also reinforced my decision to end the relationship. If this was how Daniel's family handled conflict and accountability, it gave me insight into why he'd been so defensive and unwilling to take responsibility for his actions. I hope Daniel finds someone who shares his perspective on relationships. Unfortunately, that person isn't me. After ending the call with Patricia, I felt emotionally drained but also oddly vindicated. The conversation had confirmed that the problems in my relationship with Daniel extended beyond just his individual behavior to include a fundamental difference in values about accountability and respect in relationships. Thursday evening brought Ashley's arrival from Seattle, along with reinforcements in the form of my college friend Maya, who had driven up from San Francisco when she heard about the wedding cancellation. Having my closest friends present transformed the overwhelming task of dealing with wedding logistics into something more manageable and even occasionally amusing. "Okay, let's tackle this systematically," Ashley announced, spreading vendor contracts and contact lists across my dining table. "We'll divide the remaining calls between the three of us and get this finished tonight." Maya, who worked in event planning for a tech company, proved invaluable for understanding contract language and negotiating with vendors who were being difficult about refunds. Her professional experience with last-minute event changes gave her insights into which vendors were likely to be flexible and which ones were simply trying to take advantage of my emotional state. "Don't let them guilt-trip you about lost business," Maya advised as I prepared to call the band we'd hired for the reception. "Cancellations happen in this industry, and any vendor who's been in business for more than a year has policies in place to handle them." By Friday afternoon, we'd successfully canceled or modified all the major vendor contracts and had begun the process of returning wedding gifts that had arrived early. The practical aspects of canceling the wedding were largely complete, but the emotional work of processing what had happened was just beginning. "How are you feeling about seeing your family again?" Ashley asked as we prepared to drive to my parents' house for dinner. They'd invited my friends to join us, partly as a gesture of hospitality, and partly because they wanted to discuss the situation with Natalie and the family secrets that had emerged. "Nervous," I admit. "I haven't talked to Natalie since Tuesday, and I don't know how she's handling everything that's come out." The drive to my parents' house felt strange without the usual anticipation of planning wedding details or discussing future arrangements. Instead, I was approaching my childhood home as someone whose life had been completely upended in the course of a week, unsure of what my family dynamics would look like going forward. Natalie's car was already in the driveway when we arrived, and I felt a flutter of anxiety about seeing her again. Our last conversation had ended with mutual hurt and confusion, and I wasn't sure whether we'd be able to rebuild our relationship or whether the damage was too extensive to repair. My parents greeted Ashley and Maya warmly, though I could see concern and uncertainty in their expression. The family secret about Natalie's parentage had been revealed, my wedding had been canceled, and they were clearly struggling to navigate the new reality of our family dynamic.
"How are you holding up, sweetheart?" my mother asked, pulling me into a longer hug than usual. "I'm managing. It's been a difficult week, but I think I made the right decisions. We're proud of you for having the courage to call off the wedding when you realized it wasn't right," my father said firmly. "That took real strength, and it shows good judgment about what you're willing to accept in a relationship." The support from my parents was comforting, especially since I'd been worried that they might pressure me to reconsider the decision for social or practical reasons. Their immediate acceptance of my choice reinforced that despite their mistakes regarding the family secret, their primary concern was genuinely my well-being. Natalie appeared in the living room as we were settling in for pre-dinner conversation, and I was struck by how different she looked compared to our last encounter. Instead of the emotional wreck I'd seen at my parents' house earlier in the week, she appeared composed and thoughtful, though still somewhat fragile. "Claire," she said quietly, "I'm glad you're here. I've been hoping we could talk." The conversation I'd been dreading was clearly unavoidable, but Natalie's demeanor suggested that it might be less confrontational than I'd feared. "I'd like that too." We stepped out onto my parents' back patio while Ashley and Maya continued chatting with my parents inside. The evening air was cool and crisp, with the kind of clarity that often follows emotional storms. "I owe you several apologies," Natalie began without preamble. "I was wrong to develop feelings for Daniel. I was wrong to share those feelings with him before talking to you, and I was wrong to use the DNA test results as justification for behavior that was hurtful to you regardless of our biological relationship." The direct acknowledgement of her mistakes was more than I'd expected, and it immediately reduced some of the tension I'd been carrying. "Thank you for saying that. I know the situation was confusing for you, but it was still hurtful. It was more than confusing. I was in complete crisis about my identity and my place in this family, and I made terrible decisions because I was grasping at anything that might help me understand who I was supposed to be." Natalie sat down on one of the patio chairs and stared out at my parents' carefully maintained garden. "But that's not really an excuse. Even if I was confused about my biological background, I knew that Daniel was your fiancé and that pursuing him was wrong. I let my identity crisis become an excuse for betraying our relationship." "Have you talked to him since Tuesday?" "No. After you confronted me about wearing your dress, I realized how completely I'd misread the situation and how much damage I'd done. I've been too ashamed to contact him, and honestly, I'm not sure what I would say if I did."
I felt a wave of relief that Natalie hadn't been in contact with Daniel during the same period when I was ending our relationship. It removed at least one layer of complication from an already messy situation. For what it's worth, I don't think you misread his signals entirely. When I confronted him about your conversation, he did acknowledge that he'd been considering other options and keeping backup relationships available. Natalie looked up sharply. What do you mean? I explained about discovering Daniel's inappropriate conversations with other women and his pattern of emotional infidelity that had existed long before Natalie's DNA test result. As I described what I'd found, I watched Natalie's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that looked like anger on my behalf. So he was doing this with multiple women, not just responding to my specific situation. Which means that your identity crisis might have provided him with an opportunity, but it didn't create the problem. He was already looking for alternatives to our relationship. Claire, I'm so sorry. I thought I was the only one, and I thought it meant something special about our connection. Finding out that he was doing the same thing with other women makes me feel incredibly naive and used. The hurt in Natalie's voice was genuine, and I realized that she'd been as deceived by Daniel's behavior as I had been. His carefully worded responses to her emotional vulnerability had made her feel special and understood, when in reality she was just one of several women he was stringing along as backup options. You weren't naive, you were vulnerable and confused, and he took advantage of that. Someone who genuinely cared about both of us would have handled your crisis differently. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the full scope of Daniel's deception, and our own roles in the situation that had developed. What happens now? Natalie asked eventually. With us, I mean, are we going to be able to get past this? I'd been wondering the same thing since Tuesday. The betrayal had been significant, but understanding the context of Natalie's behavior and learning about Daniel's pattern of manipulation had helped me see the situation differently. I think we can get past it, but it's going to take time and probably some professional help. We need to rebuild trust, and I need to process my feelings about everything that's happened. I'd like that. I'd like to try to repair our relation. Natalie paused, then added, and Claire, I want you to know that regardless of what the DNA test showed, you're my sister. You're the person who taught me how to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and listened to me cry about boys in high school. Biology doesn't change any of that. The acknowledgement brought tears to my eyes. Throughout all the chaos of the past week, I'd been worried that learning about our biological relationship would fundamentally change how Natalie and I related to each other. Hearing her affirm that our shared experiences and emotional bonds were more important than genetics provided a foundation for rebuilding our relationship. You're my sister too, and I'm sorry if I made you feel like the DNA test results changed that. They don't. We hugged for the first time since the wedding dress incident, and while it felt slightly tentative, it also felt genuine. The road to fully repairing our relationship would be long, but we'd taken the first important step by acknowledging what had happened and committing to working through it together. Dinner with my parents and friends was surprisingly pleasant, given the circumstance. My parents had clearly made an effort to create a supportive environment, and Ashley and Maya helped keep the conversation light while still acknowledging the significance of what I was going through. Have you given any thought to what you want to do now? Maya asked as we were finishing dessert. I mean, in terms of your living situation, your work, your general life plans. It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about too deeply. For the past year, most of my major life decisions had been made with Daniel's preferences, and our shared future in mind. Now that I was single again, I had the freedom to make choices based solely on what I wanted, but I wasn't entirely sure what that was. I think I want to stay in Portland for now. My work is here, my support system is here, and I'm not ready to make any major changes while I'm still processing everything that's happened. That sounds wise, Ashley agreed. Give yourself time to figure out what you actually want rather than making reactive decisions. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside for a private conversation. Claire, I know this week has been incredibly difficult for you, but I want you to know how proud your father and I are of how you've handled everything. It would have been easier to ignore the problems with Daniel and go through with the wedding, but you chose to face the truth even when it was painful. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot, especially coming from you. I also want to apologize again for keeping the secret about Natalie's parentage for so long. We thought we were protecting both of you, but we created a situation where she felt disconnected from the family, and where you were both deprived of important information about your family history. I understand why you made the decisions you did, even if I don't agree with them. What matters now is that we're all committed to being honest with each other going forward. My mother nodded, tears forming in her eyes. No more secret. We're going to figure out how to be a family based on truth rather than the stories we thought would protect everyone. The commitment to honesty felt like another important step in rebuilding our family relationship. The secrets and deceptions that had shaped our family dynamics for decades were finally being dismantled, creating space for more authentic connection. On the drive back to my apartment, Ashley and Maya debriefed the evening and helped me think through the practical and emotional challenges that lay ahead. How do you feel about the conversation with Natalie? Ashley asked. Better than I expect. I think we're going to be able to work through this, but it's going to require ongoing effort from both of us. And what about the Daniel situation? Are you feeling confident about your decision to end the relationship? I considered the question carefully. The past few days had been emotionally exhausting, and I'd questioned my decision multiple times, but seeing Natalie's reaction to learning about Daniel's pattern of behavior with other women had reinforced that I'd made the right choice. Yes, I'm confident. Even if the situation with Natalie hadn't happened, the other evidence of his emotional infidelity would have been enough to end the relationship. I deserve someone who's fully committed to building a life together, not someone who's constantly evaluating other options. What about the practical stuff? The apartment lease, the shared finances, all the logistics of separating your lives after 3 years together. The practical implications of ending the relationship were daunting, but they felt manageable compared to the emotional work I'd already done. We'll figure it out. I'm more concerned about rebuilding my sense of who I am as an individual rather than as half of a couple. Maya, who had gone through her own difficult breakup the previous year, offered some perspective. The practical stuff resolves itself pretty quickly. The emotional work takes longer, but it's also more rewarding. You get to rediscover parts of yourself that you might have set aside to accommodate someone else's preferences and expectations. As we reached my apartment building, I felt grateful for the friends who had dropped everything to support me through this crisis. Their presence had transformed what could have been an isolating and overwhelming experience into something more manageable. Thank you both for being here. I couldn't have gotten through this week without your help. That's what friends are for, Ashley replied. And Claire, you should be proud of yourself. A lot of people would have ignored the red flags and gone through with the wedding, because it was easier than dealing with the consequences of calling it off. That night, as I lay in bed in my quiet apartment, I reflected on everything that had changed in the span of a week. 7 days earlier, I'd been a woman planning her wedding, excited about building a future with someone I thought I loved and trusted. Now I was single, my family relationships were in flux, and I was facing the challenge of rebuilding my life based on truth rather than the carefully maintained illusions that had shaped my recent past. But despite the pain and uncertainty, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The life I'd been planning with Daniel had felt increasingly constrained and inauthentic, even though I hadn't been able to articulate why. Now that I understood the problems that had been lurking beneath the surface, I had the opportunity to build something better. The wedding dress still hung in my parents' closet, a symbol of the future I'd thought I wanted, but instead of representing loss and disappointment, it was beginning to feel like a reminder of the courage it had taken to choose truth over convenience. Whatever came next, it would be built on a foundation of honesty and self-respect, rather than the compromises and deceptions that had characterized my relationship with Daniel. For the first time in years, my future was completely open, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but it was authentically mine in a way that my planned future with Daniel had never been. 3 months later, I sat in a coffee shop near my office, waiting for someone I never thought I would meet. Kelly Morrison, formerly Kelly Hoffman, had agreed to drive up from San Diego for what she'd described as a conversation that's 24 years overdue. Finding her contact information had taken Ashley's legal expertise and several weeks of careful detective work. Kelly had remarried and taken her husband's surname, built a successful career as a pediatric nurse, and raised 2 children who were now in high school. From the outside, her life looked stable and happy, but I'd wondered for months whether she ever thought about the daughter she'd given up. The decision to reach out to Kelly hadn't been made lightly. After several sessions with a family therapist, Natalie had expressed a desire to learn more about her biological mother, but she'd been too nervous to make contact direct. As her sister and someone who'd grown comfortable with difficult conversations over the past few months, I'd volunteered to serve as an intermediary. Kelly walked into the coffee shop precisely on time, and I recognized her immediately despite never having seen a recent photo. She had Natalie's dark hair and brown eyes, along with a similar bone structure that made their biological relationship obvious once you knew to look for it. She appeared nervous but determined, scanning the room until she spotted me waving from a corner table. "Claire," she said as she approached, her voice carrying a slight tremor, "thank you for reaching out. I've been thinking about this conversation for longer than you might imagine. We ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes exchanging pleasantries about the drive from San Diego, in the unseasonably warm weather Portland was experiencing. But I could see that Kelly was eager to address the real reason for our meeting. "How is she?" Kelly asked finally, her composure cracking slightly. "How is Natalie?" The simple question contained decades of suppressed maternal concern, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by the genuine emotion in Kelly's voice. "She's doing well. She's working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm downtown. She has good friends, and she's been handling the recent revelations about her parentage better than any of us expected. Does she hate me for giving her up, for disappearing from her life?" The vulnerability in Kelly's question reminded me that this situation had been difficult for everyone involved, not just for those of us who had discovered the family secret recently. "She doesn't hate you. She's curious about you and grateful that you made the decision to place her with our parents, rather than trying to raise her in circumstances that wouldn't have been good for either of you." Kelly's relief was visible. I was so young and so scared. I kept telling myself that she'd be better off not knowing about me, that my presence in her life would only complicate things for her. "What changed your mind about meeting with me?" "My husband found me crying over an old photo of her that your mother had sent me when she was about 6 months old. I'd kept it hidden in my jewelry box for years, but lately I'd been looking at it more often." Kelly paused to compose herself. "When he asked me about it, I told him everything. About the pregnancy, about giving her up, about the promise I'd made to never contact the family. He told me I was being foolish and that if she was reaching out, it meant she wanted to know me." The revelation that Kelly had been thinking about Natalie regularly was something I knew would mean a great deal to my sister. One of Natalie's biggest fears had been that her biological mother had forgotten about her entirely, or regretted the decision to place her for adoption. "She would like to meet you if you're open to that. Not immediately, but eventually when you both feel ready. I would love that more than I can express. But Claire, I need you to understand something about why I made the choices I did 24 years ago." Kelly proceeded to tell me a story that filled in details my parents had either forgotten or never known. She'd been involved with a man who was already married, someone significantly older who had convinced her that he was leaving his wife. When she'd discovered she was pregnant, he'd immediately cut off contact and threatened legal action if she tried to pursue him for support. I was working part-time at a department store, living in a studio apartment that I could barely afford, and I had no education beyond high school. The idea of raising a child alone in those circumstances was terrifying. But why the secrecy? Why make my parents promise never to tell her about you? Because I was ashamed. I was ashamed of being so naive about the relationship, ashamed of getting pregnant, ashamed of not being able to provide for her myself. I convinced myself that if she grew up thinking she'd been wanted and planned for by your parents, she'd feel more secure than if she knew her biological mother had been an irresponsible teenager. The explanation helped me understand the mindset that had led to decades of family secrets. Kelly's shame had created a situation where everyone had been trying to protect Natalie from truths that might actually have helped her understand herself better. Natalie is an incredibly strong and compassionate person. I don't think learning about your circumstances would have made her feel less secure. It might have helped her understand some of the identity questions she's struggled with over the years. I realize that now. 24 years of perspective has taught me that secrets usually cause more harm than truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. We spent another hour discussing logistics for a potential meeting between Kelly and Natalie, along with the complications that would arise from Kelly's husband and children learning about Natalie's existence. Kelly had decided to tell her family the complete truth about her past, despite the disruption it might cause. They deserve to know they have a half-sister, and she deserves to know she has siblings. "We've all lost too much time already because of my fear and shame." As Kelly prepared to leave for her drive back to San Diego, she handed me a small wrapped package. "This is for Natalie. It's a locket that belonged to my grandmother, the only thing of value I owned when she was born. I always hoped that someday I'd be able to give it to her." The gesture was so meaningful that I felt tears forming in my eyes. "She'll treasure this, especially knowing that you've been thinking about her all these years. Will you tell her that not a day has passed without me wondering about her? That giving her up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but that I've never regretted it because I knew she'd have a better life with Richard and Linda." I promised to convey the message, and we parted with plans to arrange a meeting between Kelly and Natalie within the next few weeks. The conversation with Kelly had been emotionally intense, but it felt like another important step in healing the wounds that family secrets had created. As I drove home, I reflected on how much had changed since that day I'd found Natalie wearing my wedding dress. The cancellation of my wedding had initially felt like a catastrophe, but it had ultimately led to discoveries and growth that wouldn't have been possible if I'd gone through with marrying Daniel. Learning to trust my instincts about relationships and to prioritize authenticity over social expectations had been painful but ultimately liberating. My relationship with Natalie had not only recovered, but had actually become stronger than it had been before the crisis. The family therapy sessions we'd attended together had taught us to communicate more directly about our feelings and to address conflicts before they festered into resentments. My parents had also made significant changes in response to the revelations about their decades-long deception. They'd started couples counseling to examine their own patterns of communication and decision-making, and they'd made a commitment to transparency that was already improving their relationships with both Natalie and me. Even my professional life had benefited from the crisis. The experience of canceling a wedding and rebuilding my personal relationships had given me insights into authentic communication that had improved my work as a graphic designer. I'd started specializing in projects for nonprofit organizations and small businesses that valued genuine storytelling over polished marketing facades. 6 months after calling off my wedding, I'd also started dating again, though very casually and with a much clearer sense of what I wanted from a romantic relationship. The experience with Daniel had taught me to pay attention to early warning signs of emotional unavailability, and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I'd been seeing someone named Marcus for about 2 months, a teacher who worked with special needs children and who had impressed me with his genuine interest in understanding my family situation and supporting my healing process. Unlike Daniel, who had always seemed more interested in the advantages that came with dating someone from my family's social circle, Marcus was attracted to my individual qualities and supportive of my independent goals. The contrast between my relationship with Marcus and my previous relationship with Daniel was striking. Where Daniel had been charming but ultimately self-serving, Marcus was quietly thoughtful and consistently reliable. Where Daniel had maintained emotional distance while keeping other options available, Marcus was fully present and committed to building something genuine together. I wasn't ready to make any major commitments yet, but I was learning to appreciate the difference between a relationship built on genuine compatibility and one built on mutual convenience and social expectation. As I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, my phone buzzed with a text from Natalie asking how the meeting with Kelly had gone. I'd promised to call her as soon as I got home to share the details of our conversation. "How did it go?" Natalie asked immediately when she answered my call. "Better than I expected. She's been thinking about you constantly for 24 years, and she would love to meet you when you're ready." I could hear Natalie crying softly on the other end of the line. I was so afraid that she'd forgotten about me or that she'd regret giving me up. Neither of those things is true. She kept a photo of you that Mom and Dad sent when you were a baby, and she told me that giving you up was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but that she's never regretted it because she knew you'd have a better life. What is she like? Do we seem similar? I described Kelly's appearance, her profession as a pediatric nurse, and the warmth and genuine concern she'd shown during our conversation. I also explained about her husband and 2 children, and her decision to tell them about Natalie despite the complications it might create. "You're going to have a half-brother and half-sister," I added. "Kelly wants them to know about you and she thinks they'll be excited to meet you." The conversation with Natalie lasted for over an hour as she processed the information about Kelly and asked dozens of questions about their meeting. By the end of the call, she'd decided that she wanted to meet Kelly in person within the next few weeks. "Are you nervous about meeting her?" I asked. "Terrified," Natalie admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in my life, I'm going to meet someone who shares my DNA and might be able to help me understand some things about myself that have never made sense." 3 weeks later, Kelly made another trip to Portland, this time to meet Natalie face-to-face. I served as a supportive presence during their first meeting, which took place in my parents' living room with the full family present. The initial meeting was awkward, as most reunions between biological family members tend to be, but it was also deeply moving. Kelly and Natalie shared obvious physical similarities, but more importantly, they discovered personality traits and interests that had clearly been passed down genetically. Both women were artistic, both had struggled with anxiety in their early 20s, and both had an unusual ability to connect with children and animals. The commonalities helped explain some of Natalie's characteristics that had never quite fit with our family's typical pattern. "I always wondered why I was so different from the rest of you," Natalie said to my parents during the meeting. "Not in a bad way, just different. Now I understand that some of those differences came from Kelly's side of my heritage." The meeting between Kelly and my parents was initially tense, with decades of unspoken regret and different perspectives on the decisions that had been made. But by the end of the afternoon,
they'd found a way to acknowledge their shared love for Natalie and their mutual commitment to supporting her well-being going forward. We all made the best decisions we could with the information we had at the time, my father said as the visit was winding down. What matters now is that we're all committed to being honest with each other and to putting Natalie's happiness first. Kelly returned to San Diego with plans to bring her husband and children to Portland for a longer visit during the summer. The integration of Kelly's family into our family structure would undoubtedly create new complications and adjustments, but it felt like a positive development rather than a burden. As summer approached, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with finding Natalie in my wedding dress. What had initially seemed like a betrayal and a crisis had ultimately led to greater honesty, stronger relationships, and a clearer understanding of what I wanted from life. The wedding dress itself had eventually been donated to a non-profit organization that provided formal wear to women who couldn't afford to purchase their own. Rather than representing a failed relationship, it had become a symbol of new beginnings for someone else who was starting their married life with genuine love and commitment. My story had begun with discovering that the people I trusted most had been keeping significant secrets from me. It had continued with the painful realization that my romantic relationship was built on deception and emotional manipulation, but it had ended with the creation of more authentic connections based on truth, vulnerability, and mutual respect. The crisis that had started with a wedding dress had taught me that sometimes the most devastating revelations lead to the most important growth. By choosing truth over convenience and authenticity over social expectations, I discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed and created relationships that were deeper and more meaningful than anything I'd experienced before. Looking back, I could honestly say that finding Natalie in my wedding dress had been one of the most difficult and most valuable experiences of my life. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my family and my romantic relationship, but it had also given me the opportunity to build something better based on honesty and genuine love. As I watched Natalie develop a relationship with Kelly and witnessed my parents working to become more transparent in their communication, I felt grateful for the courage it had taken to face those uncomfortable truths. The life I was building now was more challenging but also more authentic than the one I'd been planning with Daniel. The future remained uncertain, but it was a future based on truth rather than carefully maintained illusion. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt exciting rather than frightening. Whatever came next, I would face it with the knowledge that I could handle difficult truths, and that authentic relationships were worth the effort required to build and maintain them. The wedding dress was gone, but the strength and wisdom I'd gained from the crisis it had precipitated would last a lifetime. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.